On our last program, we began a series which we'll conclude today called Prophecy Lost and Found. It is an article written for our March magazine by Gary Stearman, and it's a fascinating story of how in the 2nd and 3rd centuries prophetic teaching was abandoned and have only in the last couple of centuries been revived. Now, we spent the last program talking about how the early church moved away from the study of prophecy because by the end of the 1st century and the death of the last apostle, John, the Lord had not yet returned. This must have been very discouraging to the early church, and so they began to look for reasons why the Lord had not returned. Gary Stearman is here to discuss prophecy, lost and found.
Well, on our last broadcast, we discussed prophecy lost. And I must say, it's a little bit depressing to review church history and to see how the days of the Roman emperors provided a kind of a steady downhill slide, if you will, away from the watchful expectation of Jesus' return and into a new Christian philosophy in which Christianity came to be viewed as the salt of the earth, the preserving factor. And in fact, it came to view itself as the precursor of the kingdom. That is, the only thing left after the 5th century was the actual return of Jesus. Everything had been done that was to be done.
In fact, this idea of preterism has become popular because there are some who think that the prophecies, for example, in the book of Revelation, were all fulfilled in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple.
Right.
Prophecy over. And when we come to Constantine and the development of the state church, he waved money in front of the eyes of the ministers, saying, "We can pay your salaries. We can take tax money and build your cathedrals. We can build cathedrals so big it just be mind-boggling." And he built one of the most fanciest of the cathedrals in Constantinople. Today, of course, it's a Muslim mosque.
Yes.
But he lured the church and all of the ministers into thinking, the kingdom has come. This is the Messianic kingdom. We have arrived. We're going to be able to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. We're going to be able to save mankind. This is terrific. They didn't understand, did they?
No, they didn't. Now, we left off with Augustine. He is considered the theological doctor of the Roman Church. He lived from 354 to 430. And he wrote The City of God, in which he saw the City of God as being Rome, basically dispensing blessing throughout this world.
Now, isn't it amazing that his city was Rome?
Yes, it
not
is.
Jerusalem, not the New Jerusalem.
That's
It was
true.
Rome.
Now, he divided time from God's perspective into 6 ages. Age 1, Adam to Noah. Age 2, Noah to Abraham. Age 3, Abraham to David. Age 4, David to the Babylonian captivity. Age 5, Babylonian captivity to Christ's first advent. Age 6, Christ's first advent to his second advent. And those 6 ages encompassed everything. He did not believe in what we call the millennial reign of Christ on earth, the kingdom of David in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
He was, as has come to be called today, he was amillennial or amillennial. Didn't believe in a millennium.
Yeah, only 6 ages here, not the 7th age.
That's right. Not the 7th.
And these 6 ages, by the way, are not dispensations.
Right.
Dispensations means that it's an era when God dealt with men in a certain way and presented him with a certain test, and at the end of each of the dispensations, man was a total failure. That's not the way Augustine lays out the ages here.
Now, J.R., this writing, these theological ideas laid out by Augustine became the dominant ideas in eschatology for the next 1,000 years. And in fact, even through the Reformation, the ideas laid out by Augustine concerning the ages continued to reign supreme in the Roman Church. And this brings us now to the 14th and 15th centuries, the time of the Reformation. You had John Huss and John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, And their quest, J.R., was to bring the Bible to the common man. At that time, the Bible was in Latin. Bibles were chained to the wall of the cathedral. You couldn't take one home.
Or chained to the pulpit.
Yes, that's correct.
No one was allowed to even look at it or read it but the priest.
And Wycliffe lost his life because he dared to try to bring the Bible in English to the common man. But yet we saw here a movement. In history we see this movement to bring faith down to the level of the common man, that this had been suppressed for 1,000 years. By the 16th century, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Huldrych Zwingli launched a series of public protests against the corruption of the Roman Church. And J.R., that's where the name Protestant comes from. They were protesting the indulgences of the Roman Church.
And with that, of course, came the idea that we should look at the Bible literally. Everything was allegorical interpretation. Israel was no more. The church was Israel. And the church was going to actually inherit every promise that was made to Israel. But with this Reformation came the idea that we should look at the Bible and read it and believe what it literally says, the literal interpretation. If the Bible says it, that's the way it is, and we don't allegorize it and make all the promises to Israel given to the church.
But one thing that we must stress here is that Reform theology, while protesting the Roman practice of obtaining indulgences, for example, buying one out of purgatory or buying one's status in the church, while it protested those things, it did not protest the eschatology of Augustine. So Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, the others retained what Augustine had taught about prophecy. They retained the idea of the 6 ages. They retained the idea that the church would bring the kingdom into the world. And so in Lutheranism, in the Calvinist theology, in Anglicanism, and several other isms of state churches of Europe, they retained the eschatology of Augustine. They had not yet come to consciousness about the true plan of God.
And even though the early church included the book of Revelation in the canon of Scripture, they did not understand it. It was Dionysius of Alexandria. And by the way, Alexandria is where they had this great library, you know. And he was a very learned man. And yet he says, I cannot understand the book of Revelation. There's no way in the world I'm ever going to be able to explain it. It just... And some of them, were getting the idea, well, poor John, he really went off the deep end in his old age, and he got Alzheimer's disease, and had all these crazy visions, and they had no idea. Eusebius wrote that he could not understand it, and that he doubted some of the things that were written in it. And yet John had said, don't you change a word of it. That's what he said in the end of the book of Revelation.
Yes, in fact,
don't you change a word of it. Well, they couldn't understand it. They would love to have changed a word of it if he hadn't told them not to.
As a matter of fact, it's fascinating that in the book of Revelation, there is a specific warning not to add anything, otherwise there will be a curse attached to that.
Absolutely.
The importance of it was very great indeed, but J.R., you cannot understand Revelation until you've put things into perspective across a dispensational timeline, if you will.
Absolutely, and you remember what John Calvin said about it.
Oh, I remember John Calvin and the book of Revelation. I think you can quote that better than I can.
He said, when I look at it, it gives me a headache. And he wrote a lot of commentaries.
Yeah.
John Calvin did not write a commentary on the book of Revelation. He wrote commentaries on nearly every other book in the Bible, but not the book of Revelation. He couldn't understand it, and he didn't even want to understand it.
Now, from the 5th century until the 19th century, now that's a long time, J.R.
Yes.
This condition continued to prevail, a condition in which there was a blindness, if you will, to the role of the church and to the role of prophecy regarding the regathering of Israel. All the things that we take for granted today, the dispensations, were totally unknown. This brings us to a signal year in the history of the church. 1800 was the year, and in that year, John Nelson Darby was born in England. Now, as a youth, he was not a believer, but he was a gifted student. At Trinity College, he received the gold medal as a scholar in classics and mathematics. By the way, in classics, JR, that means that you had to understand Hebrew, Chaldean, dialects, Aramaic, Greek. You had to be able to speak Latin fluently, and also all of the European languages then being spoken.
Wow. He was brilliant.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He was a gold medal scholar, and upon graduation, he decided to become a lawyer. So in 1822, he was called to the Irish bar as a barrister, gained a reputation for having a very clear mind, and he was thought at that time to be one of the most brilliant lawyers practicing. But now comes the interesting part. At approximately the same time, he was converted to Christ, and he was so moved inwardly that he decided that he wanted to become a member of the clergy. He decided the law is not for me, and he was ordained to the Anglican clergy, and this happened in 1826. Now, from the beginning, JR, he had problems with the Anglican Church. He began to have doubts about the close allegiance between the church and the state. And in a biography by Max Veremchuk called John Nelson Darby, a biography, and by the way, this book is very difficult to obtain, and I'm sorry to say we can't offer it to you.
It hasn't been in print since the 1930s.
Yeah, it is not a recent book at all. But in this biography, Veremchuk writes this: Darby held Christ and not the king, that is the King of England, to be the true head of the church. This charge, he simply substituted the king for the pope. He began to have grave doubts about the church. And then something fascinating happened, JR. Riding a horse, one day he had saddled the horse, climbed aboard at the stables, and the horse bucked and kicked, and he was thrown against a stall and fell to the ground. He broke his leg and also fractured his knee, apparently. And he was grievously injured and had to spend 3 months in bed. And during that 3-month recuperation, he read the Bible. Not as a member of the clergy, but just as a man looking for the Lord. And it revolutionized his life. And what he discovered was, and he continues to talk about this over and over again, what he discovered was that there would be a reign of David as king in Jerusalem and a return of the Jews to Israel. Well, this was a shocking revelation to him.
Isn't that amazing?
It is.
Yes, he saw the prophetic plan. He saw the big picture, that God was going to bring the Jews back home, that there had to be a restoration of the nation of Israel, that the church was not the recipient of all those promises to the Jews. The allegorical interpretation of Augustine was not what the Bible said. So when he read the Bible, it just was an amazing thing. As he started in Genesis and went all the way through the book of Revelation, he came out of that convalescent period of 3 months a new man. I mean, he had a totally different view of Scripture. And he realized, as he looked at those things, that there were dispensations there.
Yes.
That God dealt with the human race in different ways, in different dispensations. And at the end of each dispensation, mankind failed. Was
Absolutely.
a total failure.
It was a total failure. This was a brand new way of looking at things. Now, speaking in Geneva, Switzerland in 1840, he had begun at this time to develop his ideas and speak publicly about his new way of interpreting the Bible, which, by the way, is not new at all. It just simply goes back to the apostles. And in a speech entitled "The Progress of Evil on the Earth," he says, what we are about to consider will tend to show that instead of permitting ourselves to hope for a continued progress of evil, and that the hope of earth being fulfilled with the knowledge of the Lord before the exercise of his judgment and the consummation of the judgment on earth is delusive. He said, if you think the church is going to bring peace,
bring in the kingdom,
and bring in the kingdom, you are deluded. Now, those are revolutionary words, J.R.
Well, that was exactly opposite to what the Roman Catholic Church had taught since Augustine. that the church would bring in the kingdom.
And it was exactly the opposite of what was being taught in Lutheranism and in Anglicanism as well.
Yes.
So if a man ever started out to get himself in trouble, it was John Nelson
Yeah.
Darby.
He said the church is going to fail.
Exactly.
He went on to say, for example, I've seen a lot of great ministers that are better men than me, but as far as the church itself is concerned, it is a failure.
And here's a sentence from an actual speech of Darby, quote, "Then I say the church as thus set up is ruined, and I cannot find a better word for it," end quote. He saw the church of his day as absolutely ruined. He said, believers, yes, but the structure of the church itself is in ruination.
So he started a Bible study movement. Tell us about that, Gary.
Well, he started a Bible study movement in which he taught the dispensations, the idea of dispensationalism. And J.R., let me read one quick sentence. He said in a speech, "God has always begun by placing his creatures in a good position, but by infidelity, the creature has invariably abandoned the position in which it has been placed by God. After long sufferance, God never reestablishes anyone in the position from which he has fallen." He starts a whole new, quote unquote, dispensation.
Yes.
He became the father of modern dispensationalism. And J.R., he purchased a building to teach his new dispensationalism.
Actually, it was his friend Wygram that bought this building.
That's right.
As you wrote this, I thought, wow, because Wygram, talk about scholarship.
Yeah.
Look at this. This is Wygram's Englishman's Greek Concordance of the New Testament. And look at this one. This is Wygram's Englishman's Hebrew Chaldee Concordance of the Old Testament. This is scholarship, and he was a friend of John Nelson Darby. The two of those men got together with the buying of this building and set up not a church exactly, but a Bible study group. And
Yes.
this changed history.
It changed history in ways that we shall see. You're right, J.R. It had momentarily slipped my mind. It was George Wygram that bought this chapel, which started out with a few people, quickly grew to around 700 people. This was in Plymouth, England, in 1831. And going on into the 1830s. These men said, we don't want to be thought of as a denomination. We've essentially had it with denominationalism. We've seen what it did to all the churches of Europe. We just want to be a Bible study group. And so they came to call themselves the Brethren. Well, a newspaper man covering this new group of brethren called them by a name that he himself invented. Since they were meeting in Plymouth, England, he called them the Plymouth Brethren, and the name stuck. The Plymouth Brethren became, against John Nelson Darby's will, a denomination. And he and George Wygram published hymnals. They published, as J.R. showed you, the Englishman's Greek and Hebrew concordances. By the way, J.R., they published Bibles in every language in Europe. Darby, being a skilled translator, translated the Bible into Spanish, I believe Italian, French, and German, among other languages, so that everybody would have access to the Bible.
Amazing. This idea of the dispensation, I know we're running out of time here, but he said at the end of each dispensation, man failed. The dispensation of innocence ended with the fall of Adam and Eve.
Yes.
The dispensation of conscience then ended with the flood, and on and on and on. It's every dispensation. The dispensation of law ended at Calvary with the rejection of the Messiah. Darby was right.
He was right. He was such a revolutionary, such a hero of the faith, and I wish we had even a third program to discuss this man, because at his death in 1882, Darby had launched what was fondly referred to as the Bible study movement. It lay at the foundation of the great missionary society movements. C.I. Scofield, the man responsible really for the Bible study movement in America, was deeply influenced by Darby.
Yes.
He wrote Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, and of course the famous Scofield Reference Bible.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, just a side note, I've used the Scofield Reference Bible since I was 10 years old. So I know what you're talking about here. C.I. Scofield worked with D.L. Moody's evangelistic organization until he finally, came of age and moved out to his own organization. And he published this Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, one of the most famous little booklets on how to interpret the Scriptures. So we certainly see the movement that was promoted by Darby and the Plymouth Brethren.
Absolutely. And JR, we have about 2 minutes left here, and now comes the explosive part because of this whole story, because thoughts and words have consequences.
Yes.
Darby died in 1882, firm in his belief that Israel was going to return to the land, and that through a series of events prophesied in the Old Testament, Israel would become the head of the nations. Well, upon the very year of his death, 1882, the first Aliyah, those Jewish immigrants came into Israel and began to rebuild the land. What a coincidence.
Yes, and then there was William Heschler, who was schooled by the Plymouth Brethren, who helped Theodore Herzl establish the World Zionist Organization.
Absolutely, and of course there was the Balfour Declaration, World War I, which gave the land back to the people. But JR, when this happened and the Jews started going back in the 20s and 30s, the British said, oh no, what have we done? These Jews are going to cause political upheaval. The Arabs don't like this at all. We better put the clamps on those Jewish immigrants. And enter a man by the name of Colonel Ord Wingate, serving in Palestine in those days in the British Army. He saw all this perfidious doublespeak being done by the British, and he took it upon himself to found the Israeli Liberation Army to help the Jews come back into their land. And guess what? Colonel Ord Wingate had been schooled by the Plymouth Brethren.
Yes. And General Edmund Allenby, that liberated Jerusalem in 1917, was a Christian. These men believed that the Jews were going to come back. And Christians have helped the Jews return to their promised land. In 1948, when the Jews became a nation, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Gary, this was the signal event.
It was,
of
indeed.
Prophecy being fulfilled, that this was the generation that would see the return of Christ.
Prophecy was lost. It lay dormant for 1,500 years. In 1830, it experienced a rebirth based upon the knowledge that Israel was re-entering the land. Friends, guess where we are today? We have seen Israel challenged in every conceivable way, and God's promise to build them up. And JR, I think we're living in very interesting times right now.
This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.